I'm back with the xTool F2 Ultra, and we're going to get into some brass coin embossing. I've also teamed up with Coincraft Studios to get access to some amazing digital designs that are going to be featured in this video. And I also have some new strategies and upgrades to help manage with the insane amounts of brass dust that's produced by embossing. So you're definitely going to want to keep watching because I think you'll find that very valuable. And as always, if you're looking for the xTool F2 Ultra or anything else featured in this video, including those digital designs, you'll want to check the video description down below where you'll find some affiliate links. And using those links will cost you nothing extra, but it goes a very long way to help keeping this channel alive. So let's get started.
Before we get right into the examples, I want to just briefly reference a problem that you may have noticed in the previous video that I did with the xTool F1 Ultra with the deep embossing of brass coins. The coins themselves looked amazing and there was no issues with the performance of this machine, but I want to just draw your attention to one of the inherent issues with deep embossing of brass coins, and that is the byproduct of very fine metal dust. This metal dust will collect pretty much everywhere. Obviously, it's going to get sucked into the exhaust fan, and anything that doesn't go through your exhaust system that goes airborne could settle on all of your work surfaces, or even worse, inside of your lungs. During and after the making of that video, I prototyped a few different solutions for at least addressing the issue of the brass dust clogging the exhaust fan at the back of the F1 Ultra. But I didn't have a whole lot of success with this approach. Ultimately, some of the brass dust still made it past the filter, and the stuff that was captured by the filter clogged those small pre-filters almost immediately. And those small pre-filters also didn't address the issue of dust escaping elsewhere into the room or even settling on the lens. And if you've ever done brass coin embossing on an xTool machine or any other machine for that matter, and all of those fine brass dust particles are getting sucked into your fume filtration system, you'll know that even with a very large pre-filter like the one on this filtration system, it will very quickly get fouled. This result here is from a single brass coin. So in this video, I do have some new solutions as well as some new suggestions on how to address some of these things. For example, with the F1 Ultra at that time, to get rid of the dust that's escaping the machine and settling on work surfaces, I put the entire F1 Ultra and now the F2 Ultra inside of one of these 3D printing tents. I'll link to this tent in the video description down below, but both of these machines fit nicely inside. You can zip the front cover shut, and there's also a hole at the back where you can route your exhaust hose. And now there's more of a slightly enclosed area for brass dust to settle. And now with the F2 Ultra, you can see with the exhaust fan at the back, if I were to process this coin, we would obviously have the same problem as with the F1 Ultra. And to make matters worse, some of the accessory ports are now right at the back near the fan. Now there is this cover, and the F2 Ultra fan can be removed and can be washed, but ultimately I still think that if we can avoid getting brass dust caught up in all of this stuff, it's the best case scenario. And so what I've seen people do with open frame MOPA lasers is to just put an exhaust pipe beside the coin, and it will suck up at least some of the brass dust. This approach would bypass the dust getting sucked into the exhaust fan at the back and perhaps ruining those bearings, or at least having you have to take the machine apart and clean it. And this gave me an idea to come up with a system where we could more efficiently capture and control all of that brass dust right at the source. So first, it starts with this fixture, and you can see right in the middle there's a hole. It's sized perfectly for a 40mm brass challenge coin. The fixture attaches to the F1 F2 Ultra base plate using some M4x10 socket head cap screws, and there are additional M5 holes if you wanted to use this on a generic MOPA laser, where I believe most of them have a hole spacing on the base plate with M5 threaded holes that are 25mm apart on center. So it's compatible with both. Now to the side of the fixture, we're going to have this exhaust port, and you can see there are two sizes. The larger of the two sizes will fit the black xTool exhaust hose, and it will just press fit on there. And there's a smaller port size that will fit a generic flexible 2-inch hose, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. This part also has a pair of mounting holes that use the exact same M4x10 socket head cap screws that work with the F1 and F2 Ultra base plates. Now for those, you will need one of these Allen keys with a ball end. Now just like the fixture, there are 2 additional holes on this same piece that again would line up perfectly with a generic MOPA fiber laser base plate with those 25mm on-center M5 threaded holes. So the intent behind this kit is that it would be compatible with the F1, F2 Ultra, as well as a generic MOPA fiber laser. So now once we've got this piece installed, I can take the black xTool exhaust hose and I can press it over top of that exhaust port. Then I can take my brass coin and I can place it in the fixture. Now to capture all of the brass dust, there is going to be this box that slips over top of everything. And I'm showing you the final 3D model right here, because in this video, you're going to see several different revisions of it, starting with one of the earliest revisions. And as the video goes on, we'll work through some of the natural design progressions of that box. But essentially it goes over top of the brass coin, and it allows the laser to pass through and obviously still process the coin, but will not or should not allow any of the brass dust to escape. All of it should go through that exhaust port, and this should solve many of our problems. So none of the brass dust should escape this system and collect at the rear exhaust fan or on the lens of our machine, and hopefully none of it should also go airborne. So we'll start there, and as the video goes on, we'll also address some of the other issues, such as the clogging of the pre-filters that I showed you a moment ago. So right now we're going to go into xTool Creative Space and set up our first job with the F2 Ultra. I have embossment selected in the processing type, and then I've gone ahead and focused the laser on the top surface of the 40mm brass coin. Now I've imported my first graphic, and with embossments, you are going to need to use a depth map. Now, this is outside of the scope of this video. I did cover this in depth, no pun intended, in my xTool F1 video. So if you guys want to learn about that, please check out my F1 Ultra embossing video. It will teach you what a depth map is, how to generate them with various methods, and even how to modify them. So I'll put links to that in the video description down below. And so while I was talking about that, essentially all I've done right now in xTool Creative Space is resize the depth map graphic to something around 40mm. I've created a vector circle, which is 40mm, and now I'm overlaying the two, and I'm adjusting the size of the graphic to fit inside of that circle such that I can use the vector circle and I can select the image together in the object list, right click, and then create mask. And what that's going to do is use the circle to crop out everything outside of the circle. So all I'm left with is this perfect circular graphic to fit inside of the 40mm coin. Now in xTool Creative Space, we have to set the material type. So I'm clicking in the top right hand corner, and I'm going to go to more xTool materials, and inside of their now what's called atom library, we can go ahead and search for a material type such as metal and narrow it down by a search term like brass, or we can just scroll through the whole thing and eventually find the 40mm brass challenge coin settings. They do have other presets in there for other types of brass, but when you're doing embossing, you really want to look for these blank commemorative coins, and then you'll see here that it already has the F2 Ultra selected. The laser type is the IR laser, and if you click on embossment, it's going to give you all of the presets, but you don't have to remember any of those. You can just add those to xTool Creative Space, but then you still have to click back up in the top because now it's in your favorites list, and then you can just select that. However, what that will do is reset the thickness. So you can see that it's gotten back up from 4mm to 3mm. So I'm going to use the buttons on the front of the F2 Ultra to refocus the lens onto the top of the surface. And by refocusing the laser, it's triggered any other screen capture. But you can see when I select the graphic, it already knows that I want to do the embossing. So all of the preset settings have come up. And if you click on the advanced, there is an option to also do a cleanup pass. And for this first example, I'm just going to leave that off, and I'm not going to touch any of these settings. We'll use all of the presets directly from xTool. Now, even though our graphic is perfectly centered and it looks like it lines up very nicely with the screen snapshot, what we want to do is frame our graphic. And we're going to use the outline style framing. We'll get a nice circle. And back in xTool Creative Space, if the outline for your framing isn't lining up right on center with your coin, you can just select that graphic and you can move it around using the arrow keys on your keyboard. You can do this while the framing is going on, and that will dynamically change the location of that blue laser framing that you see on the coin. And when you're happy with the final position, then you can just click on Stop Framing. At which point you're now ready to just click on the green processing button, and you'll see a preview with a time estimate in the bottom left-hand corner. So for this graphic, we're looking at an hour and a half. I have my exhaust hose with that dust box hooked up to the older style xTool smoke and fume purifier. And the reason that I'm using the older one instead of the AP2, which I also own, is that I don't have anything set up right now for pre-filtration. I've cranked that fan up to the max setting, and you can see through the side hole and the top hole of the dust box that I've got a great amount of suction. Even if I were to slowly pull the box away a few millimeters, the suction is enough to pull it back in place. So with the box properly seated, we can now press the green button on the controller to start the embossing process. Now, one thing you may also notice here is that the lid will not be able to fully shut as the hose is sticking out the side, so we can lower it most of the way down. The laser will be passing through that hole in the top of the box, striking the coin and processing it. Any reflections should not be able to come out and hit you in the eyes. You can also close the cover on the tent if you have one. But of course, without your lid fully shut, you should exercise the absolute maximum caution and make sure that you or anyone else in the room should be wearing laser safety glasses. Now, unfortunately, this dust box doesn't make much for very exciting video footage because everything is happening inside of that opaque box and I can't film through it. And you'll see here that all of the dust was successfully contained. However, not all of it actually got sucked through the exhaust hose. Some of it was settled on top of the fixture. But the good news is that it did its primary job of protecting the fan at the back. Nothing seemed to escape that box, and considering the fan at the back just automatically comes on, it's still creating some amount of suction. So logically, if anything did escape, you'd think that some of it would settle on that fan grill, and nothing appears to be sticking to that. So that's a great sign. Now, removing the coin, the embossing looks very good. This particular coin here was one of the sample materials that came with my F2 Ultra. So this is an xTool Select material, and it appears to be of very good quality and solid brass. And that's very important. In the F1 Ultra video that I told you guys you should go watch, you'll see in that video, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, that there are materials out there, cheap ones that you can buy from Amazon or AliExpress, that may not be pure solid brass. And those plated coins might contain steel or other materials that you will not be able to effectively work with, so you're going to want to avoid those. Now, removing that exhaust hose, you can see inside that it is absolutely lined with brass, and that was a pretty new hose that I had not previously run any brass coins with. So you can imagine down at the filtration end what it's going to look like. Removing the cover to access the filter of the older style xTool purifier, the result is more or less what I had expected, and the pre-filter is completely blocked. And during that embossing process, I noticed that this did have a negative impact on the amount of suction that the filtration system could produce. And it turns out that's mostly why when I had removed the dust box from over the coin, you saw a lot of brass material still left over. So I went ahead and cleaned the pre-filter just by vacuuming it with a shop vac. And then I'm going to reset our workspace here and just take a damp cloth and remove a lot of this brass dust from on top of the fixture. And so even in this case where the filtration system was partially blocked and the suction was partially lost, and then we had some brass dust in there, because it is all contained inside of the dust box, it makes things very easy and manageable to clean. At this point, I decided to move on to a different strategy in trying to capture that brass dust before it made its way to the filter system. And if you guys are familiar with woodworking, you guys have probably seen these Cyclone dust collection systems. This one is a mini version. It has two ports, one at the top and one at the side. The sticker shows the one at the top will go to your vacuum source, and the port at the side will go to the output port of our brass dust box. I'm using some very generic 2-inch inner diameter flexible hose, and it attaches to the Cyclone dust collector as well as the brass dust collection system with hose clamps. I'm going to give this one a try and see how well it collects the brass dust and if it's going to protect our pre-filter from getting clogged up. And if you guys want to experiment with one of these mini Cyclone dust collection systems, I'll put a link to that in the video description down below, as well as a link to the 2-inch flexible hose. Now back in xTool Creative Space, we're going to process a different design, and in order to crop the excess of the image, I could use the same method as the previous example by drawing a vector circle, selecting the two and creating a mask, but we do also have other options. By selecting the image and then using the cutout button at the top of the toolbar, we can manually select the black area outside of the white circle, and it's kind of like a magic wand selector, and we can just delete that excess black background and we're left with the circular image just like in the previous example. One other cool new tool inside of xTool Creative Space is this other button which shows us the embossing preview. So by selecting that image and pressing that button, we can get a 3D representation of what the outcome should look like on our brass coin. Some depth map images might have details that are difficult to see, and so using this preview will bring out a lot of those details and make them more visible. Now I'm ready to emboss this design, and I'm going to use all of the standard xTool settings for the brass coins. However, I will enable the cleanup pass. Now we can press the green processing button and it will take us to the preview screen, where again we can find that this coin will also take an hour and a half. And I should mention that this is nearly twice as fast as what I had experienced previously with the xTool F1 Ultra. With the brass dust box in place, there's not much to see during this process, and we'll just get right to the point with the final result. And again, a very nice looking coin. The F2 Ultra combined with these very nicely designed depth maps are producing very good results with some amazing details, and the depth of the embossing itself is quite deep. And if you're looking for any of the designs that I'm showing in this video, just like I had mentioned at the beginning in the introduction, you'll be able to find these on my website. I'll put a link in the video description down below, because I've teamed up with Coincraft Studios, who primarily focus on bringing you these kinds of stunning designs. And for all of the examples in this video, I'm going to be making the best use of my material, and I'm going to be embossing both sides of the coin. With this last example, despite having the Cyclone dust collection system, the pre-filter was still completely blocked, and I didn't find it to be very effective for brass dust. Now it might work better for wood dust collection, as this is what it was originally intended for, so I decided not to pursue that solution any further. I cleaned the pre-filter and went back to a trick that I'd used in one of my previous videos, where I show that standard paper towels actually make for a great pre-filter. So technically here I'm adding a layer of paper towels and I'm pre-filtering the pre-filter. The paper towels will prevent the actual pre-filter from getting clogged, and they're very cheap and disposable, plus they provide a very large surface area. If I notice a loss in suction halfway through the job, I can very quickly pause the job or even change out those paper towels on the fly. So this seems to be a pretty low effort and low cost solution to this particular problem. However, it may be the case that you don't have this exact fume extractor, and in which case you can look for some kind of inline filter solution, like a filter box or other inline filter component, where you can very easily swap in and out these paper towels. I'll put some links in the video description to some components that I think will work, and by doing it this way, it won't matter what kind of vacuum source you have. You'll just need to splice this solution into the hose between your vacuum source and the dust box. So we'll go ahead and try this with our next example, and for this I've got some new brass coins. These ones here have a polished ring accent, and I found them on Amazon. And back in xTool Creative Space, we're going to do the similar process where we take our depth map design, and I'm going to crop some of it using a vector circle. Since these coins have a polished ring, and I want to retain that because I think it's going to look pretty cool, I'm going to crop off a little more than usual, and I'm going to take this whole design and I'm going to shrink it down so it fits inside of the polished ring. To ensure it fits inside of that ring, of course, I will be using the framing feature. And as I showed you before, you're going to want to make sure that you've got your framing set to outline, and that way it will be a circle instead of a square. And then once I've confirmed that I've got it sized appropriately and positioned to fall directly within that polished ring, then I'm going to go ahead and process it. And as always, I'll be using all of the default settings within xTool Creative Space for these 40mm commemorative coins. And just like all of the other examples that I've showed you to this point, I'll slip that brass dust box on to prevent any of the brass dust from going all over the place. But this time, halfway through the job, I'm going to pause it and I'm going to change out those paper towel pre-filters that I showed you a little bit earlier. And this is going to ensure that during the entire 1 hour and 15-minute job, I have a nice amount of suction. And while the machine is paused, I'm going to open up the dust box and take a quick peek inside to get a sense of whether or not there is a large amount of dust that's built up to this point. And you can see that I think this is a pretty good amount of time to change the paper towel pre-filters. And that will also give us a pretty good reference to compare to at the end of the job, which will take about another 40 minutes. Moving over to the smoke and fume extractor, you can see that the single layer of paper towel pre-filter has been completely used up. So if you guys are going to use this paper towel pre-filtering trick, I would highly recommend that you change out your layer of paper towel around 30 to 40 minutes of processing time. Then I'll quickly swap in a new fresh layer of paper towel and I'll put the lid back on the smoke and fume extractor. The job can be resumed simply by clicking on the green button on the front of the controller of the F2 Ultra, and at the end of it, this here is the result. And you can see it looks a little bit odd. There are definitely some sections here of the coin that look underprocessed, and I thought that perhaps I had done something wrong in the settings. I went back and double checked those, everything looked normal. Next, I started to question whether or not pausing the job in the middle perhaps could be the culprit, but I'd actually done this in the past with other coins, and it had never been an issue for me. In that moment, I ended up just chalking it up as a one-off and figured I'd try and process some more coins. But later on, after trying more of these coins, it seems like it was actually a material issue. In my F1 Ultra video, I had sourced some cheap coins off of Amazon that turned out to contain some amount of iron or steel, and it was obvious because they were magnetic. Now, I learned my lesson from that, and these new coins were not at all magnetic, so I think the bulk of it is actually still brass, but there appears to be some sort of coating or plating of various thickness, perhaps not completely uniform, that the embossing process doesn't really seem to agree with too much. So the lesson here is to always source high quality materials, and we're going to continue on in our journey, and normally I would say back in xTool Creative Space, but this time it's actually xTool Studio. This is xTool's newest software, and the layout looks slightly different than xTool Creative Space, but all of the similar functionality is still there, just with some of the buttons in a different place. So we changed the mode to embossment, and on the right hand side you can also find the button to change the material. On the left hand side we have a similar toolbar, and I'll click on the little plus icon to add our graphic. And with the graphic selected, you can see some of the properties at the top. We'll change the size, and we'll also use our alignment tools to bring it to the center, the same way that we would have done in xTool Creative Space. And on the right hand side you can see the focusing height, and we'll go ahead and use that along with the buttons on the front of the xTool F2 Ultra controller to set our focus to the top of the material and then get our screenshot. Now with the graphics selected, we can click the edit button in the top right hand corner, and a bunch of editing tools will pop up on the left hand side. We can click on cutout, then I'll select manual cutout, and from there we can use the magic wand to erase the black background. Alternatively, we can still use the same method that we had done in the past by drawing a vector circle and then using that circle to crop some of the image. And for this example, I'm going to be using both methods just to show you where to find these buttons inside of xTool Studio. So I used the cutout with the magic wand to remove the black background, and now you can see I've used the vector circle that I've drawn in, and I'm just going to resize it, and then I'm going to center it, and I'm going to be using this vector circle to cut out the white rim around this entire image. And so just the same way we would have done it in xTool Creative Space, I've got the vector circle and the graphic selected, and in the object list, I'll right click on those both selected at the same time, and I'll create a mask. That will remove everything outside of that circle, and then in the bottom right hand corner of the screen, you can see the framing button. It no longer says framing, it's just a dotted square, and I'll use that to frame my image inside of the coin. And I'm gonna do the same thing that I did in the previous example. I'm gonna frame this inside of the polished circular accent of these coins. Also, a few examples back, I showed you the embossment preview inside of xTool Creative Space, and in xTool Studio, there's a preview button in the bottom right hand corner that's going to bring up the same sort of preview of the embossment. And we can use this preview to get a nice 3D representation of what the coin should look like in the end. Now you'll also notice that I have, again, the material selected as the blank commemorative coins, and because I'm in embossing mode, that will already set the same presets that were for embossing brass coins as in xTool Creative Space. So despite this being a whole new software package, it's still pulling the same presets from the same Atom library as xTool Creative Space does. And before we click the green button on the controller to start this job, I'm just showing you that within my smoke and fume extractor, I've removed the very large, thick, and fluffy pre-filter because I had run it too many times previously without any paper towel pre-filters that it's completely fouled. What I did was just replace it with even more layers of paper towels, and that should protect my actual filter mediums perfectly fine. One of the other things I started playing around with was partially blocking off one of the inlets on the brass dust box. As I had anticipated, not everybody is going to have the same vacuum source that I have, so I went ahead and redesigned the box with a valve or a shutter on the front. If your vacuum source isn't very powerful, you can slide it completely shut and then you only have the single opening in the top. Now with less surface area, even if you have a weaker vacuum source, you should still get a lot of suction. It just gives you the ability to tune the box a little bit. You'll also notice that I changed the color of the box from black to green, and there is a purpose for this. It turns out that black is one of the most efficient colors at absorbing IR laser light. Therefore, anything that may have been bouncing off of the coin was likely getting absorbed by that black plastic, and it was definitely warming it up. By using the green or a lighter color plastic, this no longer seems to be an issue, and there's a much less chance of that plastic warping. And in terms of the coin embossment, this one does look significantly better than that last example. It has some much darker sections, so it looks like the laser was able to penetrate deeper into this coin, despite it being the same material as the last one. Either that or the coating or plating on this coin was thinner, and it didn't seem to result in sections that looked under-processed. So overall, I thought that was a pretty good result. Next, we can move on to yet another design, and now we're familiar with the workings of xTool Studio. I'm going to try not to repeat myself too much, as we already know that I'm using all of these standard settings, and I'm just going to enable the cleanup pass. I am, however, going to click on that preview button one more time, just because I do really enjoy seeing what the software interprets the depth map to look like, and then of course comparing it at the end to what the actual result looks like. Now, unfortunately, during this job, I did run into a problem that I had never dealt with on this machine before, and I happened to bump into the table while the job was running, and this actually canceled the job. There is some sort of detection with the F2 Ultra, where if the onboard gyroscope is disturbed, it's going to cancel the job. And you can see the coin here was only partially processed. Now, if you are a bit of a clumsy person and you don't want a light nudge to your table canceling any of your jobs, you can go into the settings inside of xTool Studio and you can deselect the button that says stops when moved. Now, up until this point, I've been using all of the standard settings inside of xTool Studio, but as I do in all of my videos, I eventually venture outside of some of those settings or run some experiments to try and get some more interesting features and improve the final result. So right here, I'm going to show you guys how to do a nice cleanup pass on these coins to brighten them up. So for this, you can see that I've got a round vector circle drawn. I've selected engrave. We're in the process on flat surface mode, and we're going to be using the IR fiber laser. I've got the power set to 25%, but I would say anything between 25 and 35% should work. Speed is set to 2500 millimeters per second. We've got 300 lines per centimeter, bidirectional engraving mode. The pulse width set to 100 kilohertz. And in the advanced settings, I would encourage you to play with the crosshatch button on or off and see what works best for you and your designs. The cleanup pass doesn't result in any meaningful amount of dust, so I'm going to run this over one of the previous designs with the dust box off, and you can see immediately the difference that it makes. It brightens that coin right back up. Depending on the design or perhaps your personal preference or your client's preference, you may or may not want to go for this brighter look. Personally, I like it in a lot of circumstances. However, one of the things that it will do is it makes the coin look very uniform, and you may lose some contrast in some areas of your design. But luckily, I have a solution for that too, which we'll take a look at in a moment. But looking at another one of the previous examples with the cleanup pass now performed, you can see it does a very nice job of removing any areas where you may have seen some lines from the embossing. So yeah, it does exactly what it sounds like, and it cleans up your coin. But let's move on to the next example where I think that we can combine some of these different approaches and get a very nice looking design with high contrast. So I've got this graphic of the Medusa. Again, just a reminder, all of these graphics are coming from Coincraft Studios, who I've teamed up with, link in the video description down below. And I'm going to run through the usual process of cropping the image, moving it around, framing it, and getting it exactly where I want on the center of the coin. The latest and greatest version of the dust box is also slid into place. Now we're ready to go, and an hour and a half later, we should have a very beautiful result. But unfortunately, again, I ran into an issue with the material. However, this was the last time that I had to deal with this problem, because a day earlier, I went back on Amazon and found a different source for these brass coins. In the past, I had some luck with some brass coins on Amazon that didn't have that polished ring, and I was able to find those ones again. So if you guys are shopping around on Amazon, I will only link in the video description down below to the thicker of these coins without the polished ring, and I'll also link to the xTool select materials, because I know that they only deal in the highest of quality materials, and you're not going to go wrong with those, although they will just take you a little longer to get than, of course, shopping on Amazon. So once I reprocessed this design on the new coins, you can see that there was absolutely nothing wrong with them. Then I threw a cleanup pass on top, and that's going to lay the groundwork for this next step where we're going to add back some contrast. Now, it's very important during this process that you do not remove or move that coin whatsoever. Leave it in the fixture. Now, back in xTool Studio, you can see that I've taken the original depth map and I've just renamed that layer to depth map. Now I've copied and pasted it. I'm going to lock the original depth map layer, and I will disable its output. Now the copied layer, I'm going to rename just to simply engrave, and we're going to select that image, and we're going to be doing some very minor image processing or editing inside of xTool Studio. So I've zoomed in on the image, I've got it selected, and I'm just going to click on the edit button in the top right hand corner. And up at the very top, you'll see a little flyout menu that says adjustments. So we'll go ahead and click on that. Now in here, we can adjust things like sharpness, saturation, brightness, contrast, temperature, and tint. What we're going to try and do is play around with just a few of these. So for example, contrast, and by increasing the contrast, you can see how the dark colors get darker, so the blacks get blacker and the whites get whiter, and anything in between kind of goes towards one or the other. By increasing the brightness, the whole image gets a lot brighter, and we lose a lot of the gray colors as they tend to shift towards the white. And what I'm shooting for here is to actually get rid of a lot of those grayer colors and a lot of those details, make it a lot more just black and white. And one simpler way to do this is just to click on the grayscale checkbox, and now we've got a slider with two ends. So if I bring down the slider on the right hand side of the grayscale bar, you can see that it starts clipping some of the lighter colors like the lighter grays, and we're just left with the blackest of blacks. And conversely, if I grab the left end of the slider and slide it towards the right, it will do the opposite. And since we're going to try and bring back some of the darker areas of the coin, we really only want to play with the right hand portion of that slider and just slide it in maybe about a third of the way to the left. And what we're left with is a very high contrast black and white image with the darkest black shades retained. Now we get into the process settings for this new image, and you can see that we are in the process on flat surface mode. This is key. I've got the material set to brass, and I've got the engrave button selected. And this is a raster image, not a vector, so it's absolutely key that we have the bitmap mode set to grayscale. Now I'm going to adjust the power range anywhere between 40 and 80%, and you can play around with that a little bit. The pulse width is set to 500 nanoseconds, and I'm going to go back and adjust the dot duration. This is also something that you can play around with a little bit. I'm going to set it to 100 microseconds, but if you're looking for a darker engrave, then you may want to go up to about 140. Then at the bottom, the final setting was the frequency, and that's at 30 kilohertz. Now we can take our graphic and we need to overlay it perfectly with the original depth map. You can drag it directly on top and try and use the snap feature to do that, or you can click on the original image, grab its coordinates, and copy and paste those over to the new image to ensure that they are perfectly aligned. Just be sure to double check that the original depth map image has its output disabled before you go ahead and process this job. Also, during the process, if you happen to switch materials like I did from the commemorative coin to brass, then you'll also want to ensure that your focus is properly set to the top of the coin. After that, we're ready to hit the process button and bring back some of the contrast to the coin that we lost during the cleanup process. Now in this first example, you're going to see that some of the blackness does come back to the coin, but this is just with a single pass. Now you could take the approach of trying to increase the power or increase the dot duration and try and get that blackness back with a single pass, but actually I prefer to do this with multiple passes as I find it gives a much more uniform result. So in this one here, you can see that some of the darker areas were made darker and the coin looks a little more dynamic, especially in that outside geometric pattern. But I think if we go back to another one of the previous examples and we run, let's say 3 to 4 passes on this one, you'll find that the darker colors become even more prominent, especially in the larger and flatter areas. And this is going to bring out the character in the front of the coin. And although it is an embossing and already does have depth to it, the darker background is going to add the illusion of even more depth. And of course, it's going to also increase the contrast of your graphic, and it's going to draw the attention more to the focal point of the character in the center. And this isn't always going to be suitable for all designs, but it's just a nice tool or technique for you guys to keep in your back pocket, because I think it really looks amazing with some designs, specifically these ones here that are space themed. So in this design, we've got a rocket taking off into space in the foreground with the blackness of outer space in the background and some white billowing smoke in the foreground. And you can imagine what this image would look like if it were real, and you can imagine the darkness of space in the back, and that's what we're going to bring back in this design. And again, we've done the cleanup pass first, and then I've gone ahead and run the same blackening settings on this coin. Now we're viewing this under a pretty bright inspection light. The black outer space background is a little bit darker when you look at it under a normal light, but the key is that it is darker than the spaceship and the smoke in the foreground, and even some of the shadowy areas of that billowing smoke were made darker, and it just makes the whole thing look so much more dynamic and realistic. Had I stopped this after the cleanup pass, it would look a lot flatter and just less interesting. On the back side of the same coin, we're going to continue on with the space theme, and I've got a spaceman standing on some sort of extraterrestrial surface, looking back at perhaps another moon or star or planet or something. The backdrop here is again the blackness of outer space, so I've gone ahead and added the blackening step to this, but I've got one more thing here that we can try and do to make that moon or planet or whatever it is pop out a little more and look more interesting. So back inside of xTool Studio, I've taken a vector circle and placed it directly on top of that planet or moon, and then I've drawn a second vector circle that's larger, overlaid it on top of the first one, and then subtracted the two shapes, and that's going to leave us with this crescent shape. I've disabled the output of all of the other graphics, and that crescent shape I've assigned the brass cleanup settings. Then I'll run a few passes back on the coin, and that should brighten that crescent back up a little bit. And again, it's just going to add a very small feature in here that's going to make this image look ever so slightly more attractive. And these are just small creative things that you can play around with, and there are extra creative steps that you can take to set your coins apart from other people who are just clicking the process button with the standard embossment settings. And this doesn't just apply to these brass commemorative coins, it applies to all of the projects and items that you might be engraving or embossing with the F2 Ultra or your other xTool machines and that you're trying to sell online. And that also goes for the presentation of the things that you're trying to sell, whether you're on a marketplace like Etsy or you have your own website. The presentation of your creative work is important, and it's certainly a side topic, but on my YouTube channel, you'll find that I also do a lot of 3D printing, and I find that a 3D printer is an amazing tool for making small backdrops for photo shoots for your items, or even complementary items that go with the theme of the thing that you've engraved or embossed. So if you guys are here watching this video and you don't yet own a 3D printer, I would really encourage you guys to check out the other videos on my channel where I've reviewed and recommended certain printers, and I think that will take your creative game to the next level. For example, all of the props that I'm showing right now alongside these coins were printed on the Bamboo Lab H2S, and I'm going to have a video on that one in the very near future, and I'll link to that machine in the video description down below.
So that's it for this video. Thank you guys for watching right to the end. I know some of these videos can get pretty long, but that just means that I'm trying to deliver to you guys the most amount of value and pack in the most amount of information, and it takes me a long time to produce these videos. So again, if you're looking for the F2 Ultra or anything else featured in this video, use the affiliate links in the video description down below. It goes a long way to helping support this channel. It costs you nothing extra, and it's a very easy way to show your appreciation for all of the effort and work that I put into bringing to you guys this kind of content. And if you're not looking to use affiliate links, the other way that you can support this channel is simply by clicking on that like button, dropping a comment in the comment section down below, or even better, subscribing to this channel. Any sort of interaction or engagement with the video helps so much with the YouTube algorithm, and I would really appreciate that. And obviously it's completely free. So thank you again, and see you guys in the next video.